Well, thank you very much, Mr. President, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a huge pleasure for me to be with you today. Your President said that I had been appointed as Education Secretary and congratulated me on my promotion. That is exactly how it feels. Believe you me, it is a huge privilege for me to be the Education Secretary. I have served the government as the Finance Secretary for 9 years, and I have to say in the very short space in time that I've had the privilege of holding the office of Education Secretary, I have understood the enormous privilege it is to have the opportunity to shape the future of Scottish education. That is exactly what I want to do, and I want to do it in partnership with everybody who's involved in the education debate in Scotland, and to do that for the benefit and the advancement of the opportunities of young people in Scotland. So frankly, there can be, in my view, no better job to do in the Scottish Government than to have the opportunity to shape the future of Scottish education, and I look forward to doing that with you. To Susan Quinn, who just spoke in that debate, can I just say to you, Susan, your tweet about half an hour ago put a bit of a spurt into my driver getting me here this morning to make sure I could hear the debate on primary curriculum decluttering, which I'm glad I heard. Just remember the power of social media to capture the attention of the Education Secretary. I might live to regret that particular remark, but who knows. But I appreciated that debate, and I want to come back to talk about some of the issues that were raised very forcefully by a number of the speakers in that debate. But I want to set out, first of all, at the outset of my remarks, the importance I attach to having a strong dialogue with the Educational Institute for Scotland as an organisation that represents 80% of the teaching profession in Scotland. I recognise the significance of your contribution to the debate, and I am enthusiastic about taking forward that discussion and ensuring that I understand the issues that are on the EIS agenda and the issues that you wish the government to address. For my part, my driving mission as the Education Secretary will be to raise standards and to close the attainment gap in Scotland. The First Minister has said very publicly, and she said very privately to me, that her objective over a 10-year period is to eliminate the attainment gap within Scottish education, and in the next 5 years to make discernible progress on closing that gap. And that is exactly what my mandate is to do, and that will be my overriding mission. So, the challenge, reflecting on the debate that we've just heard, is that if I want to get the teaching profession focused exclusively and entirely on closing the attainment gap, then I have to listen to what we have to remove as obstacles to enabling the teaching profession to focus on closing the attainment gap. Because I recognise if we want to achieve what people will think, commentators will say, my goodness, why are you committing yourself to a 10-year exercise in closing the attainment gap? That's a very bold objective. We must have bold objectives in Scottish education, but we also must support those bold actions with practical steps to enable the teaching profession to deliver on closing the attainment gap, and that can only come about by addressing the issues of congestion within the curriculum, which have emerged for whatever reasons they've emerged, but they are there, and I recognise them, and they have to be addressed. And I'll say more about that in the course of my contribution today. So, as part of my mission to ensure that the attainment gap is closed, that the potential of young people in Scotland is fulfilled, there are three principal areas that the government will focus on in our agenda. Firstly, we want to make sure that the youngest of our citizens get the very best start in life, which is why we're committed to the transformation of early learning and childcare, with a doubling of provision, with the deployment of flexibility to help parents and particularly mothers return to work, and to ensure that there is strong educational input at the early years of education to close the attainment gap before it begins to emerge and become entrenched. And I know the development of the early years sector will be a particular priority of your next President, and one that we've discussed already. Secondly, by empowering teachers, parents and communities, by reducing workload, by ensuring that funding reaches schools to meet local needs, By focusing on what works and by being relentless in our efforts to raise standards for all children, I want us to ensure that within the teaching sector, with the school sector, we are working to close the attainment gap for good. And thirdly, by widening opportunities to higher, further and vocational education, I want to ensure that every child has the chance to progress in their choice of later educational opportunity. And I will do everything in my power to break down the barriers which prevent young people from deprived backgrounds progressing to the same levels as their more affluent peers. So these are the priorities: a firm focus on early years education, the development of the school education system to ensure that young people are able to fulfil their potential, and finally, the tackling of the attainment and access gap to our higher, further and vocational education sectors to ensure that every individual can fulfil their promise. And why is all of that important? Well, it's all important because these are three elements of the debate and the focus on the attainment gap, and unless we address all three of them, unless we close the attainment gap for our very youngest citizens in early years education and ensure that by the time young people are accessing primary education, there are not some of the pupils accessing primary education with significant educational weakness compared to other young people, we will not be successful in closing the attainment gap at later stages in life. So the importance of closing the attainment gap, of ensuring that we have in place the measures and the mechanisms to take steps to close the attainment gap will be central to the agenda that I take forward. And why is that important? It is important because every young person in our society must be able to fulfill their potential, and every one of us believes that is what we should be focused on within the priorities of our education system. But if we want to ensure that we close the attainment gap, we have to look honestly and realistically at the prospects of being able to do that, given some of the issues that you have just debated this morning and which I have discussed with primary and secondary teachers in the length and breadth of the country in the short period of time that I have been the Education Secretary. So I recognise that if we want to close the attainment gap, the quality, the effectiveness and the strength of the teaching profession is crucial to do that. And if you find that it is difficult to close that attainment gap because of the degree of congestion within the curriculum, then that is an issue that I commit to you today I will address as part of my tenure as the Education Secretary in Scotland. Now, all of us, I think, accept that there must be a continual focus on how we improve the performance of the education system, because we have, as I've talked about already, an attainment gap of which none of us approve, with which none of us are at all satisfied. But before we talk about improvement, I think it's important that we also talk about strength, because I read far too much about the fact that there is something broken about Scottish education. There are areas of Scottish education that need to improve, but I come from the starting point that we are very lucky to have an education system of such strength within Scotland, and we should celebrate that strength as part of the debate in our country. So where we concentrate on improvement, let us also have a realistic debate about the strength that exists within Scotland. Now, the government has already set out some of the measures that we'll take to close the attainment gap. In addition to expanding our attainment fund, we will shortly begin discussions to develop a new fair and transparent funding formula for schools to ensure that resources go where they are needed most within our education system. We will empower teachers, head teachers, parents and the wider community to drive more of the decisions that shape the lives of their schools. And we will implement the National Improvement Framework, supporting teachers in making professional judgments, but assisting those professional judgments by the use of new standardised assessments that will help to inform teacher judgment as part of the process. And I'll say more about standardised assessment in a moment. Now, as we undertake that journey, I want to be clear about the characteristics of reform that the government will take forward. Educational reform in Scotland will be taken forward by the government, and the education reforms will be bold and they will be substantial. But they will not be like the education reforms that are underway in England. Fundamentally, this government believes in a public education system focused on the needs of the child rather than the needs of big business. A comprehensive education system which focuses on supporting every child to succeed, not in a two-tier education system. In supporting teaching and learning, not turning teachers into accountants. And in devolving decisions and power to parents, teachers and communities, not in removing power and giving it to unaccountable private businesses. Schools are not a market, and we do not deliver improvement by introducing competition and creating winners and losers. We have a shared aim to improve the attainment and the performance of young people in Scotland, and it was in that spirit of collaboration that the government will take forward its reform of the education system in Scotland. The discussions around that will be held at the Summit on Education, which I'm convening next week, and which the EIS will be one of the many participants in that process. It will inform the delivery plan that I will publish before the summer parliamentary recess commences, and the delivery plan will be anchored in the National Improvement Framework that the government set out earlier last year. My challenge is to bring together the numerous and varied voices involved in the debate around education to ensure that the pursuit of equity and excellence is translated into concrete actions that make a real difference. One of the voices that I am most keen to hear about is teachers. In the 24 days that I've been the Education Secretary, I've held numerous discussions with teachers, without senior management present, classroom teachers, telling me the way it is. And once I've finished my speech, once I've had the questions, I want to have the opportunity to talk to you privately, face to face, about the issues that you are concerned about. Because I recognise that only once I have addressed the issues that are on the minds of the teaching profession and address that agenda, can I get the teaching profession in a position to be unequivocally focused on the closing of the attainment gap. So let me talk for a moment about the issues on teacher workload, and particularly to reflect on the discussion that you've just had in the debate. And Des Kenny, I think, said, was it Des that said it? Yeah, let me just get said that what we were good at was adding things to the curriculum, but not taking things away. And I recognise that sentiment very clearly in what I've heard from particularly the primary sector as I've gone around the country. Now, one of the points that strikes me, and I think the profession has to reflect on this, is the dilemma between curriculum for excellence, which is designed to empower teachers and to enable teachers to undertake decision-making at school level about what should be the contents of the day and the week for the education of young people in Scotland, with the call, and I've heard a bit of a call from the conference this morning, for action to be taken to declutter the curriculum by government and by Education Scotland, and no doubt in the secondary sector by the SQA into the bargain. And there is a dilemma in there between whether we empower teachers to take the decisions at local level, or whether we take central direction to specify what should be in and what should be out. And that's a dilemma that I'm currently wrestling with as to how firm I should be on that particular question. But let me convey to you a conversation I had with a primary school head teacher from Inverclyde just the other day, who said to me that he had taken a decision within his school, an area of multiple deprivation, and he had decided to give primacy within the primary curriculum to the focus on literacy, numeracy, and health and well-being, and everything else would be dealt with, but it would not have the priority that would be given to literacy, numeracy, and health and well-being. And I said to him, well, that's great, that sounds crystal clear, that sounds like some of the clarifying action that people in the primary sector are talking about that they need. And then I said to him, how do you feel about that in relation to inspection? Are you worried in any way that inspection might come along and say, you've narrowed the curriculum and you're not delivering sufficient bread to the young people. And he said to me, oh, I hadn't really thought about that, and I'm not really that fussed about it. Now, there is an issue in here, that if the primary sector wishes to focus the curriculum, then I've got to make sure, and I agree with that actually, by the way, I think that's the right thing to do. I think we need more clarity in the primary curriculum to enable young people to be founded with those strengths in literacy, numeracy and health and well-being, and yes, by touching all the other subjects that are required, but I need to also make sure that that message is reflected in the actions of Education Scotland and the inspector into the back. So I give you the commitment that that's the way my mind is thinking on these issues. That if we are going to focus, then we need to recognise that there has to be reforms and changes in the system to enable that to happen. Now, when we then come on to the workload in the secondary sector, I've already been in receipt of some of the work that has been undertaken in this respect with the report of the Working Group on Assessment and National Qualifications, which has been set out and which is a set of steps to reduce the workload for teachers and young people. And I've made clear that its conclusions will be implemented in full. Also, in late May, I asked the Chief Inspector of Education to publish national expectations for teachers and schools that will directly tackle workload issues and to help improve the learning experience of young people. In addition to that, I've asked the Chief Examiner, the Chief Executive of the SQA, to take the necessary action to implement the Assessment and National Qualifications Group to reduce teacher workload. But I've also said that's not a one-off process. I've said that I want to maintain the dialogue with the SQA and with Education Scotland about further steps to reduce the workload of teachers. Now, what I can't do is I can't take actions that will be judged to jeopardise the credibility and the strength of national qualifications. I would not be serving the young people of Scotland in any way, shape or form if I did that. But I give you the commitment today that I will take forward a sustained programme of intervention to reduce secondary teacher workload by continued dialogue, not just with Education Scotland, but with the SQA, with local authorities, and also with schools, because some of the responsibility rests on the shoulders of all of these bodies. Schools, local authorities, Education Scotland, the SQA and government, we have to work collaboratively to reduce the teacher workload. And this is where I extend an invitation to the EIS. And it's an invitation I've extended to members of the teaching profession when I've seen them in my private conversations. Set out for me, what are the things that would make the material difference? I don't want to, what I'm going to say is not said with any disrespect to any of the contributions, the fine contributions I just heard from the podium there. It is very easy to say all the extra things that are in the curriculum that shouldn't be there, that are causing the clutter, and I accept that point. But we need to take the conversation to the next level of saying, well, what are we going to take out? How are we going to deliver the focus? And my invitation to the profession is to have that conversation with me, and I will act on it because of one significant reason. I recognise, and this is what you can hold me to account for, I recognise that if we want to close the attainment gap in Scottish schools, we have to liberate teachers to enable teachers to do that. Because fundamentally, I didn't think I would be quoting The Economist magazine when I came to address the EIS conference, but I'm going to quote its article in This Week about education, in which it said, the secret to stellar grades and thriving students is teachers. So if I want to make sure that that education in Scotland is able to close the attainment gap to fulfil the promise of young people in Scotland, then I have to make sure that young people are equipped with the opportunity to experience a strong educational experience in the classroom by teachers that are liberated from a congested workload. So There is a process underway here that I have started. I've been in office for 24 days. I've already taken steps to declutter the framework that's in place in secondary schools. I will act. I'm giving you very clear signals about the primary sector, but I invite you to become involved in a conversation with me as to how we can collectively and collaboratively do this to reduce the workload of the teaching profession. Now, one of the elements of that whole process is about the National Improvement Framework, which I think is a clarifying document which sets out very clearly and simply the agenda of the government and to how we wish to take forward the approach to improving performance within education in Scotland. And I say improving performance because there is very strong performance. We need to build on that and improve it. Now, I know that the EIS have concerns about the potential burden of assessment that is implicit in the National Improvement Framework. So let me assure you about a number of points in relation to assessment. No child in primary will be sitting hour-long tests. Assessments will be as short as possible, and your professional judgment will be key in taking forward those assessments. You have an important role in supporting the gathering of this evidence and of using the framework to support your own school improvement planning. The evidence you provide through your own evaluation processes will help inform our national efforts and will help us to ensure that you get the support and the advice that you need to take forward that improvement in performance. In one of my first interviews as Education Secretary, I was asked whether the assessments will be internally or externally marked. I wasn't ready to give an answer then, but I am now. My answer is this: that's the wrong question, and it fundamentally misunderstands what we are doing. You all know, because schools already use these systems, that assessment can be delivered using modern technology that provides the results automatically. No additional workload, no high stakes, externally marked tests. It's not internal or external. It is an automatic marking and assessment process that is used to inform teacher judgment. That is the modern approach to sensible, proportionate teacher-led assessment that we need, and that is exactly what we will work with you to deliver. And why do we need standardised assessments? Well, we need them. Well, I'll tell you why we need them. We need them so that we can encourage and drive the process of improvement in educational attainment in Scotland. Because today, we cannot judge effectively where we can target interventions to support those that need that support to ensure they can fulfil their potential. That's why we need standardised assessments in Scotland. And that is what the government will work with you to deliver. That is what the government will work with you to deliver, to ensure that we deliver the improvements in performance that are required within Scottish education. Now, the government has recognised the necessity of focusing resources through the Scottish Attainment Challenge on improving the performance within Scottish education, and we announced the first stages of this last February, and we're now nearing the end of the first year of the operation of the Attainment Challenge. In the new Parliament, we've committed to expanding the Attainment Fund. We'll continue to invest in our area-based approach, but we'll increase the funding to an average of £50 million a year, up from £25 million. That allows us to significantly increase the reach and the scope of the fund. We've also agreed £20 million of funding to continue the work of the existing Challenge Authority primary programme into its second year, and I announced recently that we will increase the reach of the Challenge to add 2 further authorities to the Challenge Authority programme in East Ayrshire and Renfrewshire, both of which have significant levels of multiple deprivation. In addition, this year we will increase the scope of the challenge to include secondary schools, both in the Challenge Authority areas and elsewhere where there are schools supporting young people who live in areas with significant levels of multiple deprivation. I fully recognise that there are many children and young people living in poverty who do not live in areas with high concentrations of multiple deprivation, and that the poverty-related attainment gap is present in all schools in every part of the country. So from 2017-18, we will allocate the additional £100 million that will be raised each year from our council tax reforms directly to schools. The allocation will be based on the numbers of children in each school who meet the eligibility criteria for free school meals, and head teachers will be able to invest the extra resources in the ways they consider will have the biggest impact on raising attainment in their school. This will expand the reach and the scope of the Attainment Fund into every part of the country, with the vast majority of schools set to receive additional funding to tackle the poverty-related attainment gap. In total, we will be allocating £750 million over 5 years to close the gap in educational attainment. Now, I know many of you have concerns about the impact of the financial constraints that operate within local authorities, and as a former Finance Secretary, nobody knows better than me the challenge of working within challenging and financial times. But the Government has demonstrated a willingness to put further and new resources into the education system in Scotland, with an allocation of over £750 million of new money over the next 5 years to close the gap in educational attainment and to ensure that we do that effectively and emphatically. In conclusion, Mr. President, can I say that I am utterly thrilled to be the Education Secretary in Scotland. It is a huge job with huge challenges to ensure that we fulfil the potential of every young person in Scotland. It is an approach which is a great privilege to take that forward, and it's a privilege to take it forward with a clear sense of direction. My sense of direction is to close the attainment gap in Scotland by delivering, in partnership with the education profession and with a variety of stakeholders, an approach which is designed to deliver equity and excellence in equal measure in the education system in Scotland. I know that this profession is motivated by that same sentiment of pursuing equity and excellence, and I look forward to working with you to achieve all of that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. If we can, those people, the questions move forward. I'm not going to respond in detail to the points, other than to say we'll stand shoulder by shoulder with you, John, in terms of the strength of Scottish education and instead of the aims. And as you may have indicated there, we won't be slow in coming forward with areas of disagreement, and we look forward to continuing dialogue on those areas. Colleagues, we now have questions, and we're going to take the first 3 questions, and then John is going to respond to that. And if time, we'll see how the time's going. So first of all, on the SQA, Stephen.
Stephen Knife, Council and East Renfrewshire. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, President. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary in his speech actually touched on the question that I'm going to ask, but I want to tease it out just a wee bit further and have, shall we say, a bit more specificity, if you like. My question is on the SQA, and my secondary colleagues in the room will recognise this. Given the almost total collapse of confidence of secondary teachers in the SQA, what further very specific actions will the Cabinet Secretary take to ensure that the SQA engages in meaningful dialogue with the teaching profession to address the workload concerns of teachers and to reduce over-assessment so that the assessment system is consistent with the aims of Curriculum for Excellence?
Thank you, Stephen. And on named persons, I name Margaret Johnson, Fife. Margaret.
Good morning, colleagues, President, Mr. Swinney. At a time when the teaching profession are under enormous workload pressures, how are you going to ensure that the implementation of the named person legislation does not exacerbate the current situation?
Thanks, Margaret. And on workload, Nicola.
Good morning, colleagues. Nicola Desgupta, East Ayrshire. Mr. Swinney, we've heard that although you've only been in office for a short period of time, you have already pledged to reduce teacher workload. Can you outline specifically how you're going to do that in all sectors of education and within what time frame? As my colleague mentioned earlier, we've been promised this since 2007.
Thanks, Nicola. Cabinet Secretary.
Well, President, let me just take those questions in turn. There might be a bit of overlap between Stephen and Nicola's questions as I answer those. I hope I've given you some sense that in the short time that I've been the Education Secretary, I recognise the scale of the issue and the necessity for us to act swiftly in addressing this issue. So on the secondary issues, I've already set out, I won't repeat what I said about the Assessment and Qualifications Group and the direction that I've given to Education Scotland. I intend to sustain that on a very frequent basis. I've told the Chief Examiner I want to see her on a monthly basis to continue to explore some of the issues that the Assessment and Qualifications Group did not conclude upon, and I will continue that on an ongoing basis. I've invited the profession to identify for me the areas that and the examples where there can be actions taken to reduce the workload burden that teachers are experiencing, and that's a conversation I've had with your President and your General Secretary, and we'll continue that conversation. And it needs to, frankly, get into the level of actions that specific actions that we can take to take forward that approach. Now, I'm committed to it because of one very important reason. I see the tackling of that issue as the gateway to improving attainment. So that, and the improvement, I hope I've left you with a sense that the improving attainment point is absolutely central to everything I need to do as Education Secretary. So if my thought process is to get to improvement attainment, I've got to tackle teacher workload, that will give you a sense of the significance I attach to getting the teacher workload issue addressed. Now, Nicola asked about what sort of timescale, because promises have been made on this particular question. I'd say two things to that. The first is that in a relatively short space in time, specific reductions in workload have taken place as a consequence of the decisions that I've taken. They may not be felt quite immediately within schools, but I hope they will be felt in due course. I've also signalled in my response to the primary curriculum debate you've had this morning my understanding of what is the problem, but also what needs to be done to ensure that teachers can exercise their professional judgment to provide more focus in the curriculum without there being any jeopardy to the assessment of their educational performance of their schools. So it's a very immediate priority for me, because I need to get the profession liberated to concentrate on the attainment challenge. And so it's very much at the top of my list of priorities, and an issue that I will take forward collaboratively with the profession. Now, Margaret Johnson asked about named person, and what I want to say about this is that the named person policy is part of a very thoughtful piece of work that's been done over many years on the agenda of getting it right for every child, and there's been much participation and discussion in this whole process. The teaching profession is actively involved in assessing the well-being of young people within the education system, and in identifying young people who require particular support and assistance, and in making sure that they get that support and assistance if they require it. That is essentially what the named person will be doing, undertaking that responsibility to ensure that the well-being of young people is supported, and crucially, that if we identify young people who need support, we identify at the earliest possible opportunity before those challenges and problems become more intractable. So, and if we do that, all of the evidence shows us, and we see this evidence from the experience of Highland Council, if we do that, we then find ourselves in a situation where the caseload of young people who are wrestling with difficulties reduces, because we have intervened earlier to support those young people. So that's the structure of implementation and approach that we'll take to named person, which is about making sure that we identify at the earliest possible opportunity the needs and the experiences of young people in Scotland.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Thanks. Well, colleagues, we'll take the next 4 questions. I've just noticed there's a bit of a waiting to the northeast of Scotland, the next 4. It was coincidentally early years, Neil Duncan, Aberdeen City.
Morning, colleagues, President, Cabinet Secretary. With the SNP's clear manifesto commitment to the importance and value of early years education, will the Minister commit to making it statutory to have a teacher in every nursery class of 20 children and putting an end to the inequity and the postcode lottery of early years provision within and across local authorities in Scotland?
Thanks, Neil. And standardised testing, CFE, Mary Matheson, Aberdeen City.
Conference, Mr Swinney. Can I first of all say that we were delighted when one of the first things you said was that you were going to be a listening minister. So I'm sure you listened very carefully to the love in the room when you referred to standardised testing. So, my question to you is the proposed introduction of a further assessment burden on staff and pupils through standardised testing an indication that the principles of CFE have finally been abandoned and that the professional judgment of teachers is not to be trusted?
Thanks, Mary. And on Gurfic, we head down to the Scottish borders. Ailey.
Ailey Prelly, Scottish Borders Local Association and Council. Good morning, President. Good morning, Mr Swinney. Good morning, Conference. This question arises from the Gurfic Getting It Right for Every Child agenda. Can you tell us how the Scottish Government is going to ensure that local authorities are getting it right for every child when overall teacher numbers are reducing, workload is at an all-time high, additional needs staffing and resources and specialist support services are being cut year on year?
Thanks, Ailey. And the final question on shortage of teachers and supply cover, Elaine Fleming, Angus.
Colleagues, President, Mr Swinney. With students coming into school and being scared off with workload and lack of decent pay, what can be done to make teaching a more attractive career?
Thank you, Elaine. Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks, Mr President. On Neil's point on the a statutory commitment on a teacher being in nursery class of over 20. Obviously, it's a very important point. I've reflected in my own speech the importance of educational contribution to early years education. Whether that is something that will go into statute is something we'll consider as part of the exercise that we go through in expanding provision, and Mark MacDonald, the Early Years Minister, is undertaking that work on my behalf. So we recognise the importance of the strength of educational provision within the early years education, because that is our opportunity to begin to close the attainment gap as it emerges for young people. Whether it goes into statute or not is an issue that we will consider as part of this process, but I hear your message loud and clear. On Mary's point on standardised testing, yes, Mary, I could pick up the mood music. My old political antennae are not that sensitised that I couldn't pick that up. I'm I've made clear to you, I'm here within, well, this is my 24th day in office. I'm here because I want to be engaged and working with the profession. But we're not always going to agree on everything. And I just may as well say that now. And one of the reasons that I don't take the same view as I picked up from the mood music of the hall is that the standardised assessments are not going to be additional to, they are going to be replacements of. Because most authorities, in some shape or form, are doing some form of assessment process. But what we cannot see and what we are unable to do is to interrogate that data to show how much performance is being improved as a consequence of particular interventions and how we need to intervene more to support young people to fulfil their potential. So, standardised assessments for me are not about adding to the burden or about creating league tables or having a finger-pointing culture. They are about equipping us with the data to enable us to ensure young people are given the best chance in life to prosper. Well, that's my view, okay? We'll have a blather about it over a cup of tea, but that's why I want to have these in place to make sure that we can support the improvement of performance. Now, Mary said one other thing. Was this the abandonment of the principles of curriculum for excellence and the professional judgment of teachers? No, it is not, and it never will be. Because what we've said is that standardised assessment will be part of informing teachers' judgments. And that remains central to the strength of our education system, and nobody could conclude from what I've said today that I see anything other than the strength and the effectiveness of teacher judgment being central to the achievement of all we need to achieve in Scottish education and to close the attainment gap. Now, Ailey raised the issue of teacher numbers, and some of that is also covered in Elaine's latter question as well. I've found myself in a position of some conflict, to put it mildly, with the local authorities of Scotland by establishing that I was not prepared to tolerate reductions in the size of the teaching profession. So, I understand the concern, but if you go back and look at your press cuttings over the last 9 months or so, there's not been many charitable things said about me by local authorities about my insistence on protecting teacher numbers. So I recognise the significance of teacher numbers to our ability to deliver a strong education system in Scotland and to make sure that we have the support staff and the specialist staff to enable that to happen. I want to use the opportunity of reform in the public sector to try to bring some of the specialisms an awful lot more closely together. I was quite struck at the Scottish Education Awards by a model that was explained to me by the teachers at Redburn School in Cumbernauld, where speech and language therapists had been much more closely brought together with teachers, with a very profound effect on the communication abilities of some young people with additional support needs. And it was music to my ears of the creation of a seamless support service to fulfil the potential of young people. So as we go through public sector reform, as we try to get people to operate out with the compartments in the public sector and the great differences between health and education, which the Health Secretary and I are both committed to do, I hope we can start to make some really significant progress in that respect. Finally, on Elaine's question, I suppose it is a timely question to conclude on. The teaching profession must be an attractive profession to join. And I've seen, in the course of my travels around the country, plenty of new, highly motivated teachers entering the profession. I accept that the teaching profession has got to be attractive. That's why I've put such store on tackling the issues of workload. But it's also why I put such store on the need to change the narrative around Scottish education. Because if the narrative around Scottish education is always about what is wrong with Scottish education and not about what is strong in Scottish education, then it will be more difficult to attract teachers into the profession. So I'm committed to doing two things in this respect, to tackling the issue of workload and to making sure that we have a much stronger explanation of the strength of Scottish education and our determination to improve its performance.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Just invite the General Secretary to thank the Cabinet Secretary and to respond in some issues.
Okay, thanks very much, President. Colleagues, just on your behalf, I do want to thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking the time out to come this morning. I know that he did drop his son off at football training on the way here, and he's picking him up on the way home. So we do appreciate the fact, John, that you've made it along here this morning and that you've taken the questions. There was a very clear invitation, I think, from the Cab Sec for us to put on the table very practical proposals around our concerns. So I can guarantee you that you will receive from us, in relation to the SQA, very specific proposals where we know from our intimate knowledge of how the exams work, the SQA can move much, much quicker than it is saying to you in your dialogue. So we will take you up on that particular opportunity, John, and hopefully move forward the national qualifications situation. And I think we are heartened to hear your commitment to closing the attainment gap on the back of engaging the profession and looking to address some of these concerns. Clearly, around the issue of standardised assessment, there is more dialogue to be had, I think. We are clear, as I indicated yesterday, that being a data-rich system is a good thing, but being a data-driven system is a bad thing because it leads to target setting. I welcome your invitation to continue the dialogue in all of these areas. I think, as I said to you, John, when we first spoke after your appointment, one of the things that I think you should do is tap into the expertise of the Scottish teaching profession, because on a day in and day out basis, teachers deliver for Scottish pupils. And I think we do have shared ambitions. And again, we look forward to working with you constructively over the next period to try and realise some of those ambitions. So thank you again on behalf of Conference for attending this morning, John.